The LESHY'S Law, The Iron Roads, a sequel to the LESHY'S Law. Prologue. 20 years later. The mark appeared on Kasia Nowak's arm on her 28th birthday, exactly as Tomasz Gorski had said it would. Not a tattoo, not a scar, something living, green lines that looked like roots or veins or both, shifting under her skin as she watched. She stood in the bathroom of her apartment in Warsaw, staring at her forearm in the harsh fluorescent light, trying to remember the exact words Tomasz had used when he'd first told her about the bargain. The forest chooses when you're ready. Not when you think you're ready. When you actually are. Kasia didn't feel ready. She'd spent 6 years working alongside Tomasz, learning the old traditions from him the way he'd learned them from Mara Kowalska. She'd made offerings at the grandmother oak. She'd studied her great-grandmother's books, the same lineage Mara had inherited, passed down through generations of women who'd known the forest's secrets. She'd even met the Leshy, briefly, on a winter solstice night when the forest had seemed to hold its breath and wait. But knowledge and readiness, she was discovering, were different things. Her phone rang. Tomasz, of course. He always knew. Kasia. His voice was warm, familiar. Look at your arm. I'm looking at it. And I'm terrified. She heard him chuckle, a sound she'd come to associate with difficult truths delivered gently. Good. That means you understand what it means. Mara was terrified too. So was I. Did it help? The terror? Not even a little, Tomasz admitted. But it kept us careful. That helped. Kasia touched the mark. It was warm, pulsing slightly, like a second heartbeat. What now? Now you come to Białowieża. There's something happening. Something the forest wants you to handle. Why me? You're still the guardian. I'm 55 years old, Kasia. I've been doing this for 20 years. The forest knows when it's time for new blood. He paused. And this particular problem, it needs someone who understands both worlds. Someone who can speak the language of environmental law and EU regulations as fluently as they speak the old prayers. Kasia felt her stomach drop. The railway project. You've been following it. Of course she had. Everyone in Polish environmental circles had been following it. The Trans-European Rail Corridor, a massive infrastructure project designed to connect Western Europe to the Baltics, passing directly through northeastern Poland. The proposed route, according to leaked documents, would cut through the buffer zone of Białowieża Forest. Not the core protected area. The planners weren't quite that bold, but close enough to impact the ancient woodland. Close enough, Kasia suspected, to anger the Leshy. When? She asked. Tomorrow. Construction vehicles are scheduled to begin clearing the route. We have. She heard papers rustling, approximately 18 hours before the first trees come down. And you think the Leshy will? I don't think anything, Tomasz interrupted. But I know that the last time someone tried to build through the buffer zone, 3 people ended up transformed into trees, and one of them is still standing in his own logging yard as a warning. This is bigger, Kasia. This is an international project with billions of euros behind it. If the Leshy enforces his laws the way he did 20 years ago, it won't be 3 people. It'll be dozens, maybe hundreds. The weight of it settled on Kasia like snow on branches, soft at first, then heavier, then unbearable. I'll be there in 4 hours, she said. After hanging up, she stood in the bathroom for another moment, staring at the mark on her arm. The roots, or veins, or whatever they were, pulsed in a rhythm that didn't match her heartbeat. A different pulse. Older. The rhythm of sap rising in spring, of mycelial networks spreading through soil, of seasons turning in their ancient dance. She was connected now. Truly connected. part of something vast and patient and very, very old. The question was, what would that connection require of her? Part 1. The Cutting Edge. The construction camp sprawled across a cleared meadow 3 kilometers from the forest's official boundary. Kasia arrived at dawn to find it already in motion. Massive yellow machines warming up, workers in high-visibility vests checking equipment, engineers reviewing blueprints spread across the hoods of trucks. And at the edge of it all, facing the forest, Tomosh stood with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. "They're early," he said as Kasia approached. "Weren't supposed to start until noon. Changed the schedule? Without notifying anyone. Not the local authorities, not the environmental monitors, not us." He gestured to a cluster of men in suits near the largest excavator. "That's Jan Kowalczyk, the project manager. Former military engineer. Very efficient. Very determined." Kasia studied the man. Mid-50s, weathered face, the bearing of someone accustomed to getting things done regardless of obstacles. He was in conversation with someone on his phone, gesturing emphatically. "Has he been warned?" "3 times. By me, by the Regional Environmental Office, by the Forest Service. Each time he's pointed to his permits, which are legitimate technically, and told us that the project is proceeding on schedule." "Legitimate how?" "The buffer zone is not legally protected in the same way as the core forest," Tomosh finished. "It's a gap in the law. The EU corridor project trumps local protections. Kowalczyk knows it. He's not breaking any human laws. Just the old ones." "Exactly." Kasia felt the mark on her arm pulse. She looked toward the tree line, where Białowieża's ancient oaks stood like sentinels. The forest seemed still, but there was a quality to the stillness that she'd learned to recognize. Not peace. Watchfulness. The Leshy was already aware. "I need to talk to him," Kasia said. "Kowalczyk. He won't listen. Probably not. But I have to try." She walked across the clearing, aware of the workers watching her. A young woman in hiking boots and practical outdoor gear, her dark hair braided back, approaching the project manager of a multi-billion-euro infrastructure project. She must have looked absurd. But she had the mark. And she had a responsibility. "Pan Kowalczyk," she called out as she approached. "I need to speak with you about the forest." He glanced at her, then returned his attention to his phone conversation. "I'm busy. Talk to our public liaison. This can't wait. The trees you're about to cut are not in the protected zone," he interrupted, covering his phone. "We've been over this. The route was approved by every relevant authority. Environmental impact studies were completed. This project is legal, necessary, and proceeding on schedule." "I'm not talking about legal," Kasia said. "I'm talking about safe." That got his attention. His eyes narrowed. "Safe? We have safety protocols that exceed EU standards. Every worker here has been trained." "That's not what I mean." Kasia took a breath. "How did you explain the Leshy to someone who saw the forest as an obstacle to be managed?" "There are traditional protections associated with this forest. Old laws. People who violate them have faced consequences." Kowalczyk's expression shifted to something between amusement and pity. "Are you seriously trying to scare me with folklore? With fairy tales about forest spirits? I'm trying to warn you about something real." "What's real," Kowalczyk said, his voice hardening, "is that Poland needs this railway. What's real is that this route will bring jobs, economic development, better connections to the rest of Europe. What's real is that I have a schedule to keep and permits that give me the legal right to proceed." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I don't know who you are or what environmental group you represent, but I've dealt with activists before. Your stories about angry forest guards aren't going to stop this project." 20 years ago, Kasia said quietly, a man named Pyotr Adamczyk tried to cut trees from the protected section of Białowieża. They found him transformed into a tree himself. His body, what was left of it, is still standing in his old logging yard. It's on record. You can look it up. "I know about Adamczyk," Kowalczyk said. "There was an official investigation. They concluded it was a murder by person or persons unknown, likely related to his illegal logging activities. That's not a forest spirit. That's crime. What if it was both?" Kowalczyk studied her for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "I have work to do. If you interfere with this project, you'll be arrested for obstruction. Please leave the work site." Kasia looked past him to the forest. The trees stood silent, ancient, waiting. "I tried," she said, more to herself than to him. As she walked back to where Tomasz waited, she felt the mark on her arm pulse faster. The Leshy knew. Of course he knew. The question was, what would he do about it? 2 hours later, the first tree came down. It was an oak, maybe 200 years old, standing at the very edge of the buffer zone. Not ancient by Białowieża standards, but old enough to have weathered storms and wars and the slow passage of centuries. Kasia and Tomasz watched from Tomasz's car, parked on the forest road with a clear view of the construction site. The chainsaw screamed, the oak groaned, and then, slowly, majestically, it fell. The forest seemed to exhale. Every bird in 100 meters took flight at once. A wind moved through the trees, though the air had been still a moment before, and Kasia felt something shift in the mark on her arm, a sharp spike of pain, then a strange numbness, as if part of her had gone to sleep. "He's angry," Tomasz said quietly. "How can you tell?" "I can't. But look at the workers." Kasia did. The men who had been operating the equipment, so confident and businesslike minutes ago, were now standing very still, looking around. One of them was crossing himself. The chainsaw operator had backed away from the fallen oak and was staring at his hands. "Something's happening," Kasia said. "Not yet," Tomasz replied. "But soon. The Leshy doesn't react immediately. He observes, judges, decides on the proper response." He paused. "We should leave. You don't want to be here when he responds." They drove back to Tomasz's cottage on the forest's edge, the same cottage where Mara had lived, where her grandmother before her had lived. The place smelled of old wood and dried herbs and books. It smelled like continuity, like knowledge passed down through generations. Tomasz made tea while Kasia sat at the kitchen table, trying to process what was coming. If the Leshy enforced his laws the way he had with Adamczyk, with Jakub and the students, there would be transformations, deaths, possibly, international incidents, certainly. The project would be investigated, possibly halted, but at what cost? "There has to be another way," she said. "There is," Tomasz replied, setting a cup in front of her. "You can go to the forest tonight and negotiate with him. Ask for mercy, for restraint. Offer yourself as mediator. Like Mara did. Exactly like Mara did." He sat down across from her. "But Kasia, you need to understand something. When Mara made her bargain, she was dealing with a small-scale problem. A few students, one illegal logger. What you're facing is different. This is a state-sanctioned project with international backing. Hundreds of people will be involved. The LESHY'S laws are absolute, but the scale of potential violation here. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. How many could die? Kasia asked. I don't know. But more than we can easily explain away. More than we can pass off as bizarre accidents or unsolved crimes. This could become a genuine crisis. Kasia stared into her tea, watching the steam rise. She thought about the oak falling, about the operator's hands, about the weight of the mark on her arm. What did Mara do, she asked, when she first became the guardian? She negotiated a new balance. Enforcement of both laws, human and forest. She became the bridge. Tomosh smiled sadly. But she had time. Years to establish her authority, to build relationships, to find the middle ground. You have hours. Then I'd better get started. Part 2. The Grandmother Oak. Kasia entered the forest as the sun was setting, carrying offerings prepared according to the old rituals. Bread baked with forest herbs, honey from wild bees, water from a spring that had never been touched by modern machinery. The same offerings Mara had brought 20 years ago. She knew the way. She'd walked it dozens of times in her training, though never with this weight of responsibility. The grandmother oak stood in a clearing deep in the forest's heart, its massive trunk a pillar that seemed to hold up the sky. Kasia had always found it beautiful, but tonight it was more than beautiful. It was necessary, the anchor point, the place where the human world and the forest's ancient consciousness met and negotiated. She placed her offerings at the base of the tree, in the hollow between two great roots. Then she spoke the words her great-grandmother had written in the old book, the words Tomosh had taught her. Leshy, pan lesu, strasnik starik drag, prosykards z prosba, prosykards z secunkium, prosykards sukak sproidliwosi. Leshy, lord of the forest, guardian of the old ways. I come with a request. I come with respect. I come seeking justice. For a long moment, nothing happened. The forest remained still, and Kasia wondered if she'd done something wrong, if the mark meant nothing, if she was just a foolish woman talking to a tree. Then the bark rippled. A face emerged, not the old man's face that Mara had described, but something younger. A woman's face, made of wood and moss and living vine. Green eyes that held the depth of centuries looked at Kasia with curiosity. You are not Mara, the face said. Not accusatory. Just observational. I'm her successor, Kasia replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Kasia Nowak. Tomosh Gorski has been teaching me. And the mark has chosen you. Yes. The face shifted slightly, as if considering. You come seeking justice. But which kind? The justice of your courts and laws, or the justice of the forest? Both, Kasia said. If possible. A sound that might have been a laugh rustled through the leaves above. And if not possible? That was the question, wasn't it? Kasia thought about the construction camp, about Kowalczyk's determination, about the railway corridor that would bring progress and prosperity at the cost of the forest's integrity. Then I need to understand your justice, she said, so I can explain it, so I can help people understand before they violate your laws. The face in the oak shifted again, and Kasia realized with a start that it wasn't the Leshy himself. It was Mara, or what remained of Mara. Her consciousness merged with the forest, still present, still watchful. You've done well to come quickly, Mara said. Her voice was different from how Kasia had imagined it, gentler, tired. The Leshy is very angry, more angry than I've seen him in decades. Because of the railway, because of what it represents. Not just the trees that will fall, but the principle. For centuries, humans have taken from the forest. pushed its boundaries back, treated it as resource rather than living system. The Leshy has been patient. But this... Mara's face flickered. This feels like a breaking point. What will he do? What he always does. Enforce the law. Those who violate will face consequences proportional to their violation. The wooden face seemed to soften slightly. But you can offer him an alternative, a different balance. How? By proposing a trade. Kasia felt her heartbeat quicken. What kind of trade? The railway will be built, Mara said. We both know this. Too much momentum, too much investment, too much political will. We cannot stop it. But we can shape it. We can negotiate how it's built, what protections are put in place, what restoration happens afterward. And in exchange, the Leshy must accept limits on his enforcement. Not mercy, he doesn't grant mercy, but precision, targeting only the true violators, the ones who act with knowledge and disregard, sparing those who are merely following orders, unaware of what they're doing. It was a terrible calculus, deciding who deserved punishment and who deserved ignorance as a defense. But it was also, Kasia recognized, the only way forward. Will he agree to this? Ask him yourself. The face in the oak melted back into bark, and the tree shifted. Not physically, its trunk remained solid, but dimensionally, as if the space around it had folded. Kasia felt the familiar sensation of crossing a threshold, of moving from one reality into another. And then she was somewhere else. Still in the forest, but a forest that existed slightly sideways from the one she'd entered. The trees were taller, older, their branches forming a canopy that filtered strange green light. The air smelled of earth and rain and something ancient. Standing before her was the Leshy. He was neither the old man Mara had described, nor the wolf, nor the walking tree. He was all of these and none of them, a form that shifted as she watched, never quite settling into one shape. Man-shaped, but not a man. Animal-featured, but not an animal. A presence made of the forest itself, given momentary form to speak with this small human who had dared to enter his domain. Kasia Nowak, he said, and his voice was like wind through branches, like roots grinding through stone. You carry the mark. You serve as bridge. But you are new, untested. Why should I hear your words? Because the alternative is worse, Kasia said, surprised by her own steadiness. For both of us. The Leshy's form flickered, briefly a massive wolf with eyes like green fire, then back to something almost human. Explain. The railway is coming. You know this. You could punish everyone involved, transform them all, teach them your law through suffering. But that would bring attention. Investigation. Scientists would study the transformations. Governments would become involved. The forest would be seen as a threat to be controlled rather than a wonder to be protected. Let them try to control me, the Leshy said, his voice deepening. I am older than their governments, stronger than their science. But not more numerous, Kasia replied. They are many. They have machines, weapons, the power of nations behind them. You are powerful here, in this forest, but elsewhere? Other forests have already fallen. How many Leshy remain? How many ancient guardians still walk? The question hung in the air. The Leshy's form flickered again. Tree, then shadow, then something that hurt to look at directly. Few, he admitted finally. Very few. Most forests have no guardian now. Most trees have no voice. Then this forest needs to survive, Kasia said. Not just physically, but as a symbol. as proof that the old ways can coexist with the new, that humans can learn to respect what they don't control. And you believe this railway, this cutting, this violation, can somehow serve that purpose? I believe we can make it serve that purpose. If we're smart. If we work together. The Leshy was silent for a long moment. Around them, the forest seemed to hold its breath. "What do you propose?" he asked finally. "A negotiation. Not surrender, but strategy. We allow the railway to be built, but under conditions. Environmental monitors. Restoration requirements. Protections for the ancient trees. And most importantly, we make the builders understand, not through terror, but through education, through showing them what this forest means. And those who refuse to understand, who cut anyway, knowing what they do, those," Kasia said quietly, "you can have." The Leshy's eyes, currently shaped like owl's eyes, huge and golden, bored into her. "You would give me permission to enforce my law?" "I would," Kasia said, "but selectively, with precision, not wholesale transformation, but targeted justice. Make examples, not massacres. And if I refuse, if I demand all violators face my law?" Kasia took a breath. This was the gamble, the moment where everything could collapse. "Then I'll do everything in my power to stop the railway entirely. I'll use every legal tool, every environmental regulation, every protest and publicity campaign I can organize. I'll make this forest ungovernable. I'll make the project so controversial, so expensive, so politically toxic that it grinds to a halt." "You would do this? Oppose your own kind for my sake?" "I would do it for the forest's sake," Kasia corrected. "Because you're right. This is a breaking point. And if we break in the wrong direction, everything Mara built, everything Tomosh preserved, everything my great-grandmother knew, it all ends." The Leshy shifted one final time, settling into a form that was closest to human, an old man in peasant clothes, with bark-textured skin and eyes like deep wells. "You are braver than Mara was," he said, "or more foolish. I'm not certain which. Can't it be both?" A sound that might have been laughter rustled through the trees. "I suppose it can." He extended a hand, gnarled, wooden, but shaped like a human hand. "Very well, Kasia Nowak. We will try your way. Precision over wholesale enforcement. Education over terror. But know this, I will be watching. Every tree that falls. Every machine that enters my domain. And if your plan fails, if the violations continue unchecked." "I understand," Kasia said, taking his hand. The wood was surprisingly warm, pulsing with the same rhythm as the mark on her arm. "Do you?" The Leshy's grip tightened slightly. "Because the price of failure won't be paid by me. It will be paid by you, and by every human who depends on this forest remaining balanced." "I understand," Kasia repeated. The Leshy released her hand. The strange forest around them began to fade, reality reasserting itself. "Then go," he said. "Do your work. Be the bridge. And pray you can bear the weight." Part 3. The First Test. Kasia returned to the normal world just before dawn, emerging from the forest near Tomosh's cottage with her clothes damp from dew and her mind racing. She'd negotiated a reprieve, but it came with impossible conditions. Stop the worst violations without stopping the project, educate without terrorizing, enforce the law without mass transformation. And she had to start immediately. Tomosh was waiting on the cottage porch with coffee and the expression of someone who had not slept. "Well?" he asked. He agreed. "Sort of. We have a chance." She took the coffee gratefully. But we need to act fast. The first major tree cutting is scheduled for tomorrow. If we can't intervene before then, it's already done. Kasia stopped mid-sip. What? They started early. Again. While you were in the forest, Kowalczyk pushed his crews to accelerate. They've cleared about 3 hectares of the buffer zone. Mostly younger trees, but Tomasz pulled out his phone, showed her a photo. In the image, a massive oak lay on the ground, its trunk divided into sections, ready for transport. How old? Kasia asked, though she could guess from the size. 400 years, give or take. Officially just outside the protected zone, but you and I both know that's a technicality. That tree was part of the forest's ecosystem for 4 centuries. Kasia felt the mark on her arm pulse sharply. Somewhere in the forest, the Leshy was aware. Angry. Has anything happened? Transformations? Injuries? Not yet. But look at this. Tomasz showed her another photo, this one of the chainsaw operator who'd cut the oak. The man was staring at his hands with an expression of growing horror. What's wrong with him? His fingers are turning green. Started about 3 hours ago. By now. Tomasz checked his watch. By now he's probably in the hospital. The Leshy is keeping his word, Kasia said. Going after the actual cutters, not the whole crew. For now. But Kowalczyk will just hire new operators. And they'll keep cutting. We need a better solution. Kasia drained her coffee and stood. Then we need to talk to the project sponsors. The EU. Get them to mandate the protections directly. That will take months. Maybe years. Then we need leverage. Something that makes them want to slow down. An idea was forming, risky but possible. Tomasz, you still have contacts in the Environmental Ministry? Some. And the international preservation groups? WWF, Greenpeace, the ones that monitor UNESCO sites? A few. Why? Because we're going to make Białowieża too important to rush through. We're going to get every environmental organization in Europe focused on this railway. We're going to make it a test case for sustainable development. And we're going to do it so loudly, so publicly, that the project sponsors have no choice but to slow down and do it right. Tomasz smiled grimly. You want to turn this into a media circus. I want to turn this into a demonstration of what's possible when humans and nature negotiate instead of fight. She looked at the forest, dark against the lightning sky. The Leshy is giving us time. We can't waste it. The media campaign began with a single video. Kasia had filmed it on her phone the previous week, during one of her routine walks through the forest. Nothing fancy, just her standing near the grandmother oak, speaking directly to camera about what Białowieża meant. Not in abstract environmental terms, but personally. What it had meant to her grandmother, her great-grandmother, the generations of women who'd served as bridge between the human world and the ancient forest. She talked about the Leshy without calling him that. She talked about the forest's consciousness, the ecosystem's response to threat, the way ancient woodlands defend themselves. Language that could be interpreted scientifically or spiritually, depending on the listener's framework. And she ended with a challenge. If you're going to cut a road through 800 years of history, you should at least understand what you're cutting through. Come see Białowieża, not as tourists, as students, and learn. She posted it to YouTube without much hope. Environmental videos rarely went viral. But this one did. Within 48 hours, it had 500,000 views. Within a week, 2 million. The comments section exploded with discussion. Some supportive, some critical, many deeply engaged with the questions she'd raised. News organizations picked it up. First Polish media, then German, then the BBC. Kasia found herself giving interviews she hadn't sought, explaining concepts she'd only half understood until she had to articulate them clearly. "What do you mean by the forest's consciousness?" a BBC interviewer asked. "I mean that ecosystems have agency," Kasia said, choosing her words carefully. "They respond to threats. They coordinate defenses. The mycorrhizal networks that connect tree roots, we call it the Wood Wide Web, allows chemical communication across vast distances. When one tree is attacked by beetles, it can warn others. They're not conscious the way we are, but they're not passive resources either. And you believe this consciousness is responding to the railway project?" "I know it is. We have soil samples, chemical analyses, behavioral changes in the wildlife. The forest is reacting. Some would say you're anthropomorphizing." "Some would be wrong," Kasia interrupted gently. "I'm not saying the forest thinks like we do. I'm saying it acts with purpose, and we ignore that purpose at our peril." The interview clip went viral too. Within 2 weeks, #SaviBiałowieża was trending across European social media. Environmental groups were organizing protests. Polish citizens were writing to their representatives. The EU was receiving thousands of petitions demanding better protections. And crucially, the project sponsors were getting nervous. But the pressure created a backlash too. Kowalczyk gave his own interviews, painting environmental activists as anti-development radicals who would rather preserve trees than create jobs. Politicians who'd supported the railway doubled down, framing it as essential infrastructure that couldn't be delayed by emotional appeals to nature spirits. The debate became polarized, bitter. Kasia found herself receiving death threats alongside messages of support. Someone spray-painted "Tree Hugger Terrorist" on the wall of Tomasz's cottage. "Maybe I'm making it worse," she told Tomasz one evening, sitting in the cottage kitchen and staring at a particularly vicious email. "Maybe I should have just let the Leshy handle it his way." His way would involve multiple deaths and an international incident, Tomasz reminded her. "Your way is messy and public and uncomfortable, but it's keeping people alive while consciousness shifts. That matters." "Does it?" "If the railway proceeds anyway." "It already is proceeding differently than it would have," Tomasz said. "Look." He pulled up a news article on his tablet. The project sponsors just announced a 3-month pause for additional environmental consultation. That's your doing. The pressure is working. 3 months isn't enough. 3 months is 90 days for the forest to continue changing people's minds. Tomasz smiled. "Have faith in the process. Mara taught me that. Change takes time, but it does happen." In the forest, the transformations continued, but sparingly. The chainsaw operator who'd cut the ancient oak completed his transformation over 3 days, his fingers becoming twigs, his arms branches. He was hospitalized, studied, and ultimately declared a victim of unknown biological agent by doctors who couldn't explain what was happening to him. A second worker who had deliberately felled a protected tree against orders experienced a faster transformation. His feet rooted to the ground, and he stood for 6 hours unable to move before the forest released him, changed but alive. He left the project immediately and, according to rumors, had moved to Warsaw and refused to be near trees. But the majority of the construction workers, the ones just doing their jobs, unaware of what they were truly affecting, were untouched. The Leshy was keeping his word. Precision over wholesale punishment. The guilty, not the innocent. Kowalczyk, notably, remained untransformed. Kasia suspected the Leshy was saving him for something specific, though she didn't know what. The next week brought a development Kasia hadn't anticipated: scientific support. Dr. Helena Kowalska, the soil ecologist who would later become crucial to everything, published her findings about the forest's changing chemistry. Not in some fringe journal that could be dismissed, but in Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific publications in the world. The paper was titled Coordinated Defensive Response in Primary Forest Ecosystem: Evidence from Białowieża. It was dense, technical, filled with data and careful hedging of conclusions. But the core finding was clear: the forest was changing in ways that suggested organized, purposeful response to the railway project. "She's giving us scientific legitimacy," Tomasz said, reading through the paper. "This isn't folklore anymore. This is peer-reviewed ecology. Will it make a difference? To the people who listen to scientists? Yes. To the ones who only care about money and politics." He shrugged. Time will tell. But the tension continued to build. Because underneath the media coverage and the scientific papers and the political maneuvering, a simpler truth remained: the railway was going to be built. The question was only how, and at what cost. Part 4. The Breaking Point. 3 weeks into the railway project, Kasia received a call from an unknown number. "Is this Kasia Nowak? Who's asking?" "My name is Dr. Helena Kowalska. I'm a soil ecologist with the environmental monitoring team for the Trans-European Rail Corridor. I need to meet with you. Urgently." They met at a small cafe in Białystok, away from the forest, away from the construction site. Dr. Kowalska was in her mid-40s, professionally dressed, with the tired eyes of someone who had been working too hard for too long. "I don't know how to say this," she began, stirring her coffee without drinking it. "So I'll just say it. There's something wrong with the forest." Kasia's mark pulsed. "Wrong how?" "The mycelial networks, the root systems, the soil chemistry. It's all changing rapidly. I've been monitoring the forest's health for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this." She pulled out a tablet, showed Kasia a series of graphs and soil composition charts. "Look at this. The areas near where we've been cutting, the nitrogen levels are spiking. The fungal biomass is increasing by orders of magnitude. And the trees. What about the trees? They're talking to each other. Not metaphorically, literally. The chemical signaling between root systems has increased 100-fold. They're organizing, coordinating." Dr. Kowalska looked at Kasia with eyes that held equal parts fear and wonder. "I know how this sounds. I know it's not scientific to anthropomorphize. But Kasia, the forest is responding to the railway. And it's angry. Have you told anyone else?" "I wrote a report. My supervisor told me to revise it, make it less dramatic. He said I was making claims that couldn't be supported by the data." She laughed bitterly. "But the data is right there. The forest is fighting back." Kasia thought about the Leshy, about the bargain they'd made. Precision enforcement of the laws. But what if the forest itself, not just the guardian, but the entire ecosystem, was responding? What if the ancient network of trees and fungi and soil was defending itself in ways that went beyond individual transformations? What would happen, Kasia asked carefully, if the forest continued to change at this rate? Dr. Kowalska was quiet for a moment. Based on the current trends, the buffer zone would become hostile to all non-native species, including humans. The chemical composition of the soil, the air quality, the microfauna, it would all shift to actively reject our presence. She paused. There's a theory in ecology about forests reaching a tipping point. When enough stress is applied, they transition from passive resistance to active defense. Most scientists think it's hypothetical. But what I'm seeing isn't hypothetical. No, it's happening. And if the project continues at its current pace, we'll reach a point where humans can't safely enter the forest at all. It will reject us completely. Kasia's mind raced. This was beyond what she'd negotiated with the Leshy. This was the forest itself, the vast interconnected web of life that predated the Guardian, responding to threat the way an immune system responds to infection. How long? She asked. Until the tipping point? If cutting continues at the current rate, 6 weeks. Maybe 8. And if we stop cutting entirely, the process might reverse. Or it might not. We're in uncharted territory. Dr. Kowalska finished her coffee in one long swallow. I'm telling you this because people say you have influence, that you understand the forest in ways that our instruments can't measure. I don't know if that's true, but I'm desperate. Someone needs to stop this before we lose Białowieża forever. After Dr. Kowalska left, Kasia sat in the cafe for a long time, watching the afternoon light fade. She had a choice to make, and it wasn't an easy one. She could continue her careful negotiations, her media campaigns, her slow work of building consensus and changing minds. It was working, slowly. The project was being scrutinized, safeguards were being added, consciousness was shifting. But slowly wasn't fast enough. Or she could go back to the forest, back to the Leshy, and ask him to do what she'd been trying to prevent, enforce his law absolutely, stop the railway through fear and transformation, through making it impossible for humans to continue. It would work. She knew it would work. The Leshy could make the forest so dangerous, so unpredictable, that no amount of money or political will could push the project through. But it would also mean the end of the bridge, the end of coexistence, a return to the old, absolute boundaries between human world and wild. Kasia pulled out her phone and called Tomasz. "I need advice," she said. "I'm listening." She told him about Dr. Kowalska's findings, about the forest's accelerating defense mechanisms, about the choice she was facing. When she finished, Tomasz was quiet for a long time. "What would Mara do?" Kasia asked. "Mara would try to find a third option," Tomasz said finally. "Something that wasn't surrender and wasn't war." "Is there a third option?" "There's always a third option. The question is whether we're clever enough to find it." She heard him thinking, the silence of a man who'd spent 20 years walking the line between two laws. The forest is responding to threat. Not just the physical cutting, but the intent behind it. The treating of the forest as obstacle rather than presence. So we need to change the intent. We need to change the relationship. Make the builders see the forest as partner rather than problem. Tomasz paused. "I have an idea. It's risky, and it requires you to trust that the Leshy will play along. Tell me." Part 4a. Kowalczyk's move. 3 weeks after Dr. Kowalska's findings went public, Jan Kowalczyk made his own move. Kasia was in Warsaw, meeting with representatives from the Polish Green Party about legislative approaches to forest protection, when Tomasz called. "Turn on the news," he said without preamble. "TVN 24. Now." She found a television in the parliamentary building's lobby. On screen, Kowalczyk stood before a bank of microphones, looking every bit the confident military engineer, flanked by what looked like half the government's infrastructure ministry. "Tired of being held hostage by folklore and superstition," he was saying. "Poland needs this railway. Europe needs this railway. and we will not let our progress be dictated by stories about angry trees. The screen cut to footage: workers in the forest, chainsaws running, a massive oak coming down. Kasia recognized the location, deep in the buffer zone, an area that should have been off-limits during the consultation period. This morning, Kowalczyk continued, we resumed full operations on the Trans-European Rail Corridor. The project has been delayed long enough. We have permits, we have approval from the relevant authorities, and we will proceed. A reporter asked about the environmental concerns, about the ongoing consultation. Consultation is important, Kowalczyk said smoothly, but it cannot go on indefinitely. We've listened. We've made adjustments. Now it's time to move forward. Poland cannot remain trapped in the past, worshipping trees while the rest of Europe builds the future. Kasia felt the mark on her arm burn hot. In the forest, 300 kilometers away, the Leshy was responding. How many? She asked Tomasz, still on the line. 20 trees so far, all over 200 years old. He's deliberately targeting the ancient ones. Kasia, he's challenging the Leshy. He thinks the transformations are fake, or exaggerated, or can be managed if he just pushes through fast enough. He's going to get people killed. Yes. The question is how many? Kasia was already moving, gathering her things, heading for the parking garage. I'm coming back. Call everyone. The environmental groups, the monitors, anyone who can get to the forest and document what's about to happen. What is about to happen? The Leshy is going to respond. And this time, with this level of provocation. Kasia didn't finish. She didn't need to. The drive back to Białowieża took 4 hours. 4 hours of listening to news reports about the resumed construction, about Kowalczyk's defiance stand, about the political debate over whether economic development should take precedence over environmental protection. No one was talking about what mattered, that Kowalczyk had just violated the forest's laws on a massive scale, deliberately, and the forest would not let that stand. She arrived at the construction site just before sunset. The scene was chaos. Workers were running from the forest, faces pale, some screaming. Equipment sat abandoned, engines still running. And from the tree line, vines were emerging, thick, pulsing with unnatural green light, moving with purpose. Kasia recognized the pattern from the original incident 20 years ago, from the photos of Jakub's death. The forest was hunting. She found Tomasz at the edge of the clearing, standing with a group of environmental monitors and local police. No one seemed to know what to do. "Where's Kowalczyk?" she asked. "Inside." Tomasz gestured toward a construction trailer. "Locked himself in 30 minutes ago when it started." "When what started?" "See for yourself." He led her to where they had a clear view of the forest. What Kasia saw made her breath catch. The vines weren't just attacking randomly. They were selective, purposeful. They'd wrapped around specific pieces of equipment, the chainsaws, the heavy machinery that had been used to cut the ancient oaks, and around specific people. 3 workers were already caught, wrapped in living wood that pulsed and grew. But they weren't being transformed, not yet. They were being held, restrained, like the forest was making a point rather than exacting punishment. "They're all cutters," Tomasz said quietly. "The 3 who personally cut the ancient oaks. The rest of the workers got away. The Leshy is still being precise. For now. But Kasia, there's something else. Something new." He pulled out his phone, showed her a video one of the monitors had taken. In it, the vines moved through the forest in patterns that looked almost coordinated, like soldiers moving in formation. And at the center of it all, a figure. Not the leshy, not exactly. Something that looked like a man made of bark and moss and living vine, walking through the construction site with slow, deliberate steps. Is that? We don't know what that is, Tomosh said. It's not any form the leshy has taken before. But it's clearly his. The forest man approached the construction trailer where Kowalczyk had barricaded himself. Kasia watched, unable to look away, as it placed one wooden hand against the metal door. The door didn't open. It dissolved. Metal simply stopped being metal, became rust, became nothing. Kowalczyk stood inside, holding what looked like a pistol, his face white with fear. "Stay back," he shouted. "I'm warning you." The forest man didn't speak. It simply reached out, moving slowly enough that Kowalczyk could have run, could have escaped. But fear had frozen him in place. When the wooden hand touched his shoulder, Kowalczyk screamed. Kasia started forward, but Tomosh caught her arm. "Don't. You can't intervene in the forest's justice. He's going to kill him." "No," Tomosh said, watching carefully. "Look." Kowalczyk had stopped screaming. He stood perfectly still, the forest man's hand on his shoulder, his eyes wide and unseeing. He was experiencing something. Kasia could see it in his face, the way his expression cycled through emotions too fast to track. "What's happening to him?" one of the police officers asked. "The same thing that happened to the EU officials," Tomosh said. "The forest is showing him, making him understand." For 5 minutes, Kowalczyk stood frozen. The forest man never moved, never let go. And then, finally, it released him. Kowalczyk collapsed to his knees, gasping, tears streaming down his face. The forest man turned and walked back toward the trees. As it moved, it began to dissolve, first the details, then the form itself, until it was just vines again, retreating into the forest. The 3 captured workers were released, unharmed but shaken. The vines withdrew completely. And in the sudden quiet, Kowalczyk knelt in the doorway of his trailer and wept. Kasia approached slowly, careful not to startle him. "Pan Kowalczyk?" He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the same thing she'd seen in Henrik Svensson's eyes, understanding, the kind that comes at terrible cost. "I didn't know," he said, his voice broken. I told myself it was just superstition, just environmental hysteria. But it's real. All of it. The forest is." He couldn't finish. "Alive," Kasia said gently. "Aware. And you hurt it." "I didn't mean." He stopped, seeming to realize how hollow that sounded. "What have I done?" "You violated the forest's laws. But you're still here. Still human. The leshy could have transformed you. He chose to teach you instead." Kowalczyk looked at his hands, still flesh and bone. "Why?" "Because transformation is a last resort, not a first option. The forest doesn't want to kill people. It wants them to understand." Kasia crouched down to his level. "Now you understand. The question is, what will you do with that understanding?" He was quiet for a long time. Around them, workers were cautiously emerging from hiding, checking on the 3 who'd been caught and released. The construction equipment sat silent, no one willing to start it up again. "I'll resign," Kowalczyk said finally, "from the project. I can't. After what I just saw, what I felt, I can't be part of destroying that. I'll recommend full suspension pending complete redesign. And I'll testify about what happened here, about what the forest showed me." "They won't believe you," Kasia warned. "They'll say you had a psychological break, that the stress." I have witnesses. 3 workers who experienced the same thing I did. Environmental monitors who documented everything. And he pulled out his phone, hands shaking. I recorded part of it. The forest man. What happened when it touched me. It's not complete, but it's something. Kasia felt a small spark of hope. That could make a difference. It has to, Kowalczyk said. Because if this railway continues the way it was planned, the forest won't just show people. It will fight. And we'll lose. Not because the forest is stronger than our machines, though maybe it is, but because we'll destroy something irreplaceable in the process of defeating it. And that's a victory that's really a defeat. He stood up, steadier now, changed in ways that would take years to fully process. I'm going to make some calls. Cancel tomorrow's operations. Start the process of shutting this down properly. He looked at Kasia. Will the forest accept that? Will it trust that I mean it? Kasia looked at the mark on her arm. It had stopped burning. The angry pulse had settled back to normal rhythm. I think, she said, the forest just taught you its most important lesson. That understanding comes before forgiveness, but forgiveness is possible. You've understood. Now you need to act on that understanding. I will, Kowalczyk promised. And from the forest, just at the edge of hearing, came a sound that might have been wind through leaves. Or might have been approval. Part 5. The Third Way. The proposal was audacious. Invite the railway project managers into the forest. Not for a tour. Not for a symbolic photo opportunity. For a genuine encounter with what they were affecting. They'll never agree, Kasia said. Kowalczyk barely tolerates environmental monitors. He's not going to. We don't ask Kowalczyk, Tomasz interrupted. We ask the EU sponsors. The ones funding the project. We make it a condition of continuing the work. Senior decision-makers must spend 24 hours in the forest before any further trees are cut. And what happens to them in those 24 hours? That, Tomasz said, depends on the LESHY. It took another week of negotiation, careful political maneuvering, and leveraging every bit of international pressure Kasia had built up. But eventually the EU sponsors agreed, partly because the environmental pressure had become intense, partly because halting the project for 24 hours was easier than the alternative of prolonged delays, and partly because they were curious. What could possibly happen in one day that would change anything? The agreement came with conditions. The forest experience would include scientific monitoring. Independent observers would be present. Everything would be documented. Kasia agreed to all of it, though she worried about whether the LESHY would perform for cameras. 6 people came, 3 EU infrastructure officials, 2 project managers, Kowalczyk conspicuously absent, claiming a scheduling conflict, and 1 environmental consultant. They arrived at dawn, dressed in outdoor gear, carrying notebooks and cameras, professional and skeptical. Kasia met them at the forest's edge, with Tomasz beside her. "Thank you for coming," she said. "What you're about to experience is unusual. I ask that you keep an open mind, respect what you see, and understand that this forest is more than just trees. We've seen forests before," one of the EU officials said, a man named Henrik Svensson with the confidence of someone who'd spent his career in international development. "We understand their value, but we also understand the value of connectivity, of economic growth, of—" "You'll understand this forest by the end of today," Kasia interrupted gently. "Or you won't. Either way, it will be your choice." She led them into the woods, following paths that she'd walked hundreds of times but which she knew would be new to them. The morning light filtered through the canopy in shafts of green gold, and the air smelled of moss and rain and growing things. As they walked, Kasia spoke. Not about environmental regulations or biodiversity metrics, but about the forest's history, the centuries it had stood, the wars it had witnessed, the people who had lived alongside it, treating it with respect born of understanding rather than fear. She told them about the women in her family who had served as bridge, about Mara, who had first negotiated with the Leshy, about the old traditions that recognized forests as living systems with their own agency and rights. The visitors listened politely but skeptically. These were practical people, used to dealing with budgets and engineering challenges and political realities. Stories about forest spirits seemed charming but irrelevant. At noon, they stopped for lunch in a clearing. The monitoring equipment, the scientific observers had brought registered normal readings, air quality, soil chemistry, wildlife activity. Everything within expected parameters. But Kasia felt the mark on her arm beginning to warm. Something was coming. After lunch, she led them deeper, to a section of the forest where the oldest trees stood. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer. The sounds of the modern world, distant traffic, aircraft overhead, faded until there was only forest sound, wind in branches, bird song, the small movements of creatures in undergrowth. They reached a clearing where one of the ancient oaks stood, not the grandmother oak, but one nearly as old, its trunk wider than 3 people could encircle. This tree, Kasia said, placing her hand on the bark, germinated around the year 1200. It's been standing here for over 800 years. It survived the Mongol invasions, the partitions of Poland, 2 world wars, Soviet occupation, and the fall of communism. It's seen everything. It's impressive, Svensson admitted. But our route avoids trees this old. The ones we're cutting are younger. He stopped. The mark on Kasia's arm had started to glow. Faintly at first, then brighter, the green lines pulsing with light that seemed to echo through the forest around them. And in the tree before them, a face appeared. Not carved, not imagined. An actual face, made of bark and moss and living wood, that opened eyes and looked at the 6 humans with an expression of ancient patience. One of the project managers stumbled backward. The environmental consultant pulled out her camera, hands shaking, trying to document what she was seeing. The scientific observers checked their equipment frantically. "The readings," one of them said. "They're spiking. Chemical signatures we've never seen, electromagnetic fluctuations." "Leshy," Henrik breathed. "Not quite," Tomasz said quietly. "That's Mara, the previous guardian. She merged with the forest when she died. She's been waiting to speak with you." The face in the tree smiled, a gentle, sad expression. When she spoke, her voice was like wind through leaves, like water over stones, like something much older than words. "Welcome to Białowieża," Mara said. "You've come to cut a road through my home. Before you do, I wanted you to understand what you're cutting through." What followed was something Kasia would never quite be able to describe adequately, though she would try many times in the years that followed. The forest opened, not physically, but perceptually. Mara, or perhaps the Leshy working through her, or perhaps the forest itself, showed them what the forest was. Not just a collection of trees, but a living network. Centuries of growth and connection. The mycelial highways underground, carrying chemical messages faster than neurons fire. The chemical conversations in the canopy, trees warning each other of threats. The slow patient work of roots breaking stone and building soil atom by atom. They saw the forest as the forest saw itself, not as resource or obstacle or even ecosystem, but as a single vast organism, ancient and aware. They experienced what an oak tree experiences, the slow patient drawing of water from earth, the transformation of sunlight into sugar, the conversations through root and fungus with neighbors near and distant. They felt the presence of millions of creatures, insects and birds and mammals and fungi, all part of the forest's body, all necessary, all connected. And they saw what the railway would do to it, not in abstract environmental impact terms, but directly. They felt the pain of roots severed, the permanent scarring of mycelial networks that had taken centuries to establish, the confusion of chemical signals disrupted, the isolation of trees suddenly cut off from their community. They experienced the forest's equivalent of grief. The experience lasted maybe 10 minutes by clock time, maybe an hour. Time became uncertain in that opening, that moment of genuine communication between human consciousness and something much older and stranger. When it ended, all 6 visitors were sitting on the forest floor, some crying, some staring at nothing, all fundamentally altered by what they'd witnessed. The scientific observers were frantically checking their equipment, their data, trying to make sense of readings that made no sense at all. "I didn't know," Svensson said finally, his voice broken. He was crying without seeming to notice. "I've read the studies, reviewed the impact assessments, spent years in development work. But I didn't know. Couldn't know. It's alive," Kasia finished. "Aware. Not in the way we're aware, but in its own way. And it deserves consideration. Not just legal protection, but genuine respect." Svensson looked up at her, and in his eyes Kasia saw what she'd hoped to see: understanding. Real understanding, purchased at the cost of having your worldview fundamentally shifted. "What do you need?" he asked. "What would make this right?" "Time," Kasia said. "Decades, if possible. To plan a route that works with the forest, not against it. To develop new technologies for crossing sensitive areas without permanent damage. To make this railway a model of how infrastructure and nature can coexist. The project is already years behind schedule. Decades would kill it," one of the other officials said. A woman named Astrid, Danish, in her 50s, still sitting on the ground. "But maybe that's not the worst outcome. Maybe we need to consider whether this railway is worth the cost. Or maybe," the environmental consultant said slowly, wiping tears from her face, "we need to redesign it. Completely. From scratch. Using what we've just learned." "That's not my decision alone," Svensson said. "I'll need to bring this to the full committee. Convince them. But—" He looked back at the tree where Mara's face had appeared. It was just bark now, no sign of the consciousness that had spoken through it. "I've been doing infrastructure development for 20 years. I've never seen anything like this. Never felt anything like this. If there's even a chance that we can do this right, then we should try," Astrid finished. The scientific observers were still analyzing their data, still trying to fit what had happened into frameworks that could explain it. Kasia knew they wouldn't succeed. Some experiences defied measurement, defied explanation. They could only be accepted or denied. As they walked back toward the forest's edge, the 6 visitors were quiet. Changed. They had entered as professionals with a job to do. They were leaving as something else, people who had encountered genuine mystery and been transformed by it. At the tree line, Henrik Svensson turned back one more time, looking at the forest with new eyes. "Thank you," he said, "to Kasia, to Tomasz, to the forest itself, for showing us, for trusting us with this." "The forest chose to show you," Kasia replied. "I just made the introduction." After they left, Kasia and Tomasz stayed in the forest a while longer. The mark on Kasia's arm had stopped glowing, but it still felt warm, alive. "Do you think it worked?" she asked. "I think," Tomasz said carefully, "that we just gave 6 people an experience they'll spend the rest of their lives trying to make sense of. Whether that translates into the kind of change we need, time will tell. I wish I had your patience. You have your own version of it. Different from mine, different from Mara's, but just as real." He smiled. "The forest chooses well. It always has." They walked back to the cottage in comfortable silence, 2 guardians of an ancient trust, hoping that what they'd shown today would be enough to shift the balance toward coexistence. Epilogue. The new balance. The Trans-European Rail Corridor was redesigned. It took 5 years, not the original 2. The new route curved around Białowieża's buffer zone, using a bridge system that allowed the forest canopy to remain unbroken beneath it. Where cutting was absolutely necessary, it was done with consultation, not just with environmental monitors, but with local communities, with indigenous knowledge keepers, with people who understood the forest's old ways. And every tree that fell was replaced with 10 new ones, planted in degraded areas, tended with the kind of care that recognized them as individuals rather than commodities. The project became famous. Other infrastructure developments across Europe began using the Białowieża model, the idea that nature wasn't an obstacle to work around, but a partner to work with. Kasia became, somewhat to her discomfort, a public figure. She gave talks, advised governments, helped other communities navigate the intersection of development and preservation. But she always returned to Białowieża, to the forest that had chosen her, to the role of bridge between worlds. The Leshy, for his part, seemed satisfied. The transformations stopped. The forest's aggressive defense mechanisms eased. The ancient network returned to its patient work of growth and connection, no longer under immediate threat. On Kapolonite, 25 years after Mara first met the Leshy, Kasia stood in the clearing near the grandmother oak and watched the celebration. It had grown over the years. More people, more awareness, more genuine respect rather than thoughtless festivity. Among the celebrants she saw Tomasz's daughter, now grown, with her own mark beginning to appear on her arm. The next guardian, perhaps, or perhaps the one after that. The knowledge would continue, and standing at the edge of the clearing, visible only to those who knew how to look, the Leshy watched. Patient, ancient, eternal. The forest had survived. The balance held. For now. For this moment. And in a world of constant change, moments were enough. Kasia made her offerings, spoke her prayers, and felt the mark on her arm pulse in rhythm with the forest around her. She was part of it now. Part of the vast web of life and death and continuity that had existed long before human cities and would exist long after. She was the bridge, and she would serve, for as long as the forest needed her. The end. Author's note. This sequel explores what happens when ancient protections meet modern development at a scale that threatens not just individual trees, but entire ecosystems. While the Trans-European Rail Corridor is fictional, the tensions it represents are very real. Across Europe and the world, ancient forests face pressure from infrastructure development, and the question of how to balance human needs with ecological preservation grows more urgent every year. The Białowieża model referenced in this story, the idea of infrastructure working with nature rather than against it, is inspired by real innovations in sustainable development, from wildlife bridges to tree canopy crossings to consultation with indigenous knowledge keepers. As in the first story, the Leshy represents not just folklore, but a deeper truth, that nature has its own laws, its own agency, and deserves consideration not just because it's useful to humans, but because it has intrinsic value and meaning beyond our purposes. The question the story asks is one we're all facing. Can we change fast enough? Can we learn to see ourselves as part of nature rather than separate from it, before the tipping point is reached? The forest is still waiting for our answer.